Welcome to episode 109. It's time to scale up global education. This is going to be a chat with Laurence Peters, who will be the fourth person that we've had talking about global education during the past couple of months, and maybe the final person that we'll have for a while. Before I introduce Laurence, we're going to have pause and have a few words from Punya. Punya, you want to jump in here?
Thank you, Kurt, and welcome, Laurence. I just wanted to take a moment to, just before this show started, I got a very sad message that Michael Hughes, who was a former educator, was a student in the Master's in EdTech program at Michigan State when I was co-director of the program. He and his wife both were a part of the same cohort and had a chance to get to know them. And in many ways sort of epitomize, I think, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today in terms of global education and the kinds of values and principles we hold dear to our heart. So our heart goes out to Bindu, his wife, and the rest of his colleagues and family, as well as to the broader educator community, which is, I think, a great loss. So thank you for that moment, and just recognizing Michael, I think, was important today.
Thank you, Punya. Back to introduction of Laurence Peters. He's someone who's jumped across to this side of the pond after living in London and going to the University of Sussex for his undergraduate, or after he taught English for a bit and discovered education was his calling, and went off to Michigan to get his doctorate, and then later his law degree. And because of having a JD, he got seconded maybe to help with the US House of Representatives in forming policies and initiatives. And he was a senior policy advisor to the US Department of Education from 1993 to 2001. But he's been very active in the area of education, and especially global education, and being able to scale that up. I think one of our co-hosts who couldn't be with us tonight, Dede, did a book with him on scaling up lessons from technology-based education for educational improvement with Rowan. He's also done 2 global education books, Global Education Using Technology to Bring the World to Your Students, ISTE 2009, and his newest book, Creating the Global Classroom, Approaches to Developing the Next Generation of World-Savvy Students. And he'll probably have a copy to share with us. I have not gotten my copy yet. I'm looking forward to getting that. It's really comprehensive. If you go to the blog post for this session, you'll see the chapters listed in there. You'll see a link to the book. You'll see a link to his newsletter or his blog related to global education. You'll see a link to Laurence's homepage as well. So if you want to find out more, definitely check out the blog post. We're going to have, and there's also his slides. So he'll start off with about 6 or 7 minutes of slide overview about the state of global education today and where he sees it heading maybe in the future. So I'm going to be turning it over in a second, but just to remind you that we had world savvy people on about 5 or 6 weeks ago talking about their initiatives. And here we have someone whose book is talking about becoming world savvy. So we're taking it the next step, how to implement world savviness and global competencies with your students. What are the competencies that they need? Laurence, you want to take it over from here and maybe share a real copy of that book so we can see what it actually looks like and not look at a piece of paper?
Here we go. I'm delighted. Thank you very much for the invitation. I feel very honored to be part of your group for today. I feel like a real esteemed colleague, and thank you again. So between writing, Bringing the World to Your Classroom, I wrote a book about the United Nations. I did a temporary work as a director of the United Nations Association Graduate School program, and there's a lot of very good kind of research that was new to me about the importance of the United Nations, how much we rely on it, and it kind of got me interested in the notion that unless there is more support for the United Nations, more support for a global community, among our students that we're not going to do very well, because all of our challenges that we are confronting right now, as we all know, are global. And there's no nation can deal with climate change. No nation can deal with pandemics alone. And the list goes on. And we're all codependent, interdependent. And I think this world has emerged quite recently, kind of crept up on us in a way. I mean, we've always had a global connection. We've always been trading since the world began. There's been trade going on, international cooperation, collaboration, and exchange of all kinds over thousands of years. But the world has never been so interdependent as today. And I think I'm going to go back to that word, interdependence. But let me share a few slides, and hope we'll get into the discussion, because I know the problem is death by PowerPoint. I don't want to do that to anybody here.
So what I'll try and do is let you know we're at 6 or 7 minutes so that we can jump in and start asking questions.
Because as natural professors, we like to talk. Now, slideshow. Can you see that screen?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I manipulate a few buttons.
We are paid by words per minute. That's our salary.
Okay. Now, we've got you on there. Now we're going to change it. You are screen sharing. Good. Well, now I've got to actually show this. All right. Does that work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And we can put that onto slideshow mode. So, so my aim basically in this book is to show that global education is not an optional extra. Our aim as educators is to ensure the entire school curriculum, its culture, generates a global mindset. And I think there's good information to suggest that we put the burden too much on one teacher, the social science teacher, the social studies teacher usually, to do all that, to make their classrooms more global, or the world history teacher. But what we're seeing from, and I'll talk about it later, the PISA results on global competency, is that the whole school needs to be committed to this global mindset, because it's not just about content, it's about attitudes and dispositions. And I think that kind of is important. And if a school does not sort of show itself open to the world in many ways, inviting visitors in, not just doing fun festivals, international festivals, but going beyond that, kind of talking about current affairs in classrooms. All right, so here's the overview. Global realities are changing so fast we cannot keep up. And the easy single story narratives are disappearing. They no longer work. And now textbooks are based on these easy stories that we have, particularly about American greatness. That seems to be American exceptionalism, which is has its dark side, as we know. And my point is just made just a minute ago, that the curriculum is not the key factor in developing competency, but it's open attitudes to others. And more importantly, it's about human contact and human connection, and dealing with this thing called the other person from the other culture. That's important. And that's part of that disposition and attitudes. And I think one of the things that's missing, and I know a lot of you are technology fans and have been very supportive of introducing more technology, but the one technology that I think we haven't focused on enough, or the uses of technology, is for collaboration. And we can talk a little bit about that later. And so all schools need to have a global mindset. And as somebody was saying, I think it was Fernando Remus was saying, it's impossible to understand a business school that was not global. You can't have today a global, a non-global business school. It's impossible to imagine. We need to imagine a global, what does a global school look like? And I don't think it's a threatening notion, but some people might find it threatening. Because I don't want to talk about Putin, but I do think that we like Putin sit in a lot of bubbles. Sorry, that's my wife coming in. So excuse the, we'll skip some of that. I think that we all live in bubble worlds. I think social media has the disadvantage sometimes of reinforcing the bubble world. But there are a few issues they really care about, that students really care about, and believe that they have some control and agency around. One of them is I think, the gender issues. One of them is racial issues. Another one, a very key one, is climate change. I believe that basically the curriculum doesn't address any of these issues, doesn't really connect very well with students' interests. If basically students are living in the digital world, the curriculum is in an analog world. And we're still trying to figure out how to connect the analog world with the digital world. And I think it's trouble. And I think the more students are disconnected from that world, the more they will find reasons to drop out, reasons to disengage. Skip that. So there's somebody you may be familiar with. Arjun, don't know how to pronounce his name. Appadura? Are you familiar with him?
Appadurai.
Appadurai, thank you. He talks about scapes, narratives, worlds that we live in, which I thought was a very useful way of thinking about the world, that we can think about the flows of people, money, technology, media, and ideas. They're experienced by individuals and small communities in very different ways than we used to think about the world. So he's got 5 mental scapes. Ethnoscapes represent the movement of people around the world. Technoscapes, the ways technology helps speed up cross-border movements. Financescapes, rapid movement of money. Mediascapes, I think that's the one that we struggle with the most. And ideoscapes refers to the ideas that symbols and narratives have spread across around the globe. All these different scapes have a hard time coalescing and forming coherent patterns and shapes in people's minds, in students' minds. They live in one of these scapes. And often those scapes are reduced to bubbles. And we construct our identities around these scapes and these bubbles. Islamic fundamentalism is an ideoscape produced actually by the 21st century, by the notion of people feeling alienated from the Western cultural society, feeling that their alienation is responsibility of the West. It's somehow toxic. It's become a toxic idea. Brexit campaign helped forge a more national, robust English identity. And so people are forced into that kind of ideoscape of believing somehow that they need to take some kind of action to preserve an imagined identity. So we're getting I'm just kind of touching on these things. I'm not going to deal with them in any kind of depth here, but maybe I'll just conclude on one point. The global competency, as PISA defines it in 2018, I think it's quite a good definition. 4 highly independent dimensions. Understand understand and appreciate different perspectives and worldviews, to establish positive interactions with people of different national, ethnic, religious, social, cultural backgrounds, disposition to take constructive attitude towards sustainable development and collective well-being. My point here is that students are lost in these worlds, right? They've got to understand that they sit in a bubble and other people sit in other bubbles. And they've got to understand that how to communicate across these bubbles and across these worldviews, across these ideoscapes. in order to do that, you've got to establish positive interactions with people, with actual real people. You can't cross these boundaries, these imagined communities, without human contact. If you don't use human contact, you're stuck inside these bubbles, in these scapes. So there's a vital role that schools can play. It's to really confront these ideas. And then the third thing, which I think helps free people from the bubbles and from this notion that they don't have agency, is to actually figure out a way in which they, as individuals or as part of a community, can have an impact on one of these issues that they care about, that happens to be global, that happens to have a global dimension. So I don't want to over-complexify the thing, but we're in just to summarize, we're in a very different world than the world that we came up with. It's not an analog world. It's not a linear world. It's a world that is moving and shifting very fast, with lots of images and ideas floating across. In order to keep up, students have to figure out their place, their identity within this very fast changing world that happens to be global in so many ways. They have to figure out their position, their identity, and their attitude and disposition. And school has a vital role to play, but it's complex, but it's doable if we understand, and we start kind of understanding the issue, and don't feel like we can just outsource this. It's somehow, okay, we just do one token program, one token food festival, one token this or that. We will achieve our I mean, even study abroad, even though that's really powerful, that's not going to be the only thing that schools need to do in order to make sure that people are globally aware and can be globally competent in understanding people from different perspectives. So I'll finish it there. It's a little.
And I'll point out that we have the slides posted, but a shortened version of the slides. You started presenting the full version, so maybe I need to get that and post the full version up at the website after this show ends. And so we're going to start off with Punya with some questions, and then go to Young, and then I'll jump in. So Punya, you want to jump in here?
Sure. So thank you, Laurence. So I have a couple of questions. Let me start with this one. That one of the goals of education has always been, developing the next generation of citizens, in which the citizen word itself is interesting because it means someone who lives in a city. Well, most people don't. But even if we leave that aside, how we use that word today has a lot to do with the rise of the nation state and this idea of the nation state. And that idea is a very powerful one, right? I mean, when you think about this idea, you talk about American exceptionalism, every nation has its own story of exceptionalism, right? America just happens to control a lot of the media scape or whatever, whichever shape or form you want to talk about it. And so how do we break through this idea of the nation state models if we have to think about global education? And I'm reasonably pessimistic in some ways post-COVID, because one of the standard tropes in science fiction has been, if you look at, which was the movie with Will Smith where those aliens attack us, Independence Day, it's when we have this one enemy, an alien enemy, the whole world will come together. And if COVID has shown us one thing, that there is this alien enemy which is attacking and killing us, and instead of us coming together in order to, battle this alien virus, we actually seem to have splintered up even more. In some ways, I feel less optimistic about, at some level, the way they managed to create the vaccines and so on is a triumph of globalization.
Yes.
But at the same time, we are also seeing this very vociferous sort of pressures as well. So my question really is, how do you see the steps moving forward in a situation where it seems that it's easier to be disunited than to be united in this situation, in this world today?
I think that's a great question. I struggle with that because there is a huge appetite for seeing schools as the method by which we become American. And particularly, it's a very, Americans look on schools as a way of inculcating American values. And obviously, the history of that is because of just large-scale immigration and no other real institution in the society that was capable or equipped with that mandate to try to basically get everybody speaking English, everybody saluting the flag, everybody understand the Constitution, understand democratic values. And I think it's laudable. All I think that we need to do is not to upset that kind of approach, but to say, you know, there are other countries that have also very similar kinds of ideals and ideas that they have struggled to present to the world. Some are doing better than others in presenting their brand. I mean, Russia still wants to claim Russian exceptionalism, that they have a Russian identity that is superior and allows them to do monstrous things. The British, I was just getting my notes from my interviewing my mother a long time ago. She wrote down all the books that she read in school, and this is about 1940s when she was in school. She was evacuated, and they're all these patriotic poems and stories that obviously served a function for the British society at that time. My sense is that because we have access now to much more of the global world, we can kind of look at all these kind of structures, these narratives, as narratives. There's no one could, the idea that the American exceptionalism is the and only compelling narrative is kind of dangerous. And we should not allow people to, just, I mean, you can support your home team, you can support your national team, and you can feel proud to be American, but you have to separate this idea of patriotism from nationalism. And I think if maybe we understood those distinctions a little better, patriotism is a pride in your community, in your nation, in your history, and that is not necessarily the same as nationalism.
So Young's going to jump in here, and then we'll go back to Punya, and then we'll go to me. Young.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is actually quite interesting, what Punia's question. So I was watching TV, the January 6th committee, the prime time, I'm just looking at that as an example. Is there an American or are there no Americans? So that's one thing. I think the nation state is a challenge. But we can question that, I've written about global competency since 2009 about schools, really I value Laurence will talk about interdependence. Mm-hmm. However, I have a huge problem with the PISA global competency assessment. The framework is colonization. It is a Western economical entity trying to colonize everyone's education, which is impossible. First of all, the assessment is just a lie about itself, because you're assessing things that many schools don't even deal with. If you go to China, go to India, go to Africa, they have no interest in dealing with that. You're going to a company in countries where the media is completely controlled. You can't even watch news about other countries, So in that way, but more importantly, it is actually a very neoliberal Western perspective of what global competence is. So I was actually just curious to say, Laurence, if I were asking you to critique the PISA the global competency framework of PISA, what would you say?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think those are good criticisms. But we have to come together. There has to be some kind of, I don't know, how many countries are there? 84 countries in part of PISA. It's a large number. And the fact is that there has to be dialogue. China, those countries that do censor the news have to acknowledge some parts of their responsibility for creating a global culture. On balance, obviously you can't escape the biases. But I won't go further than that. There has to be, more active discussions.
Thank you. Punya, go ahead.
One of the things that I was thinking about that as a possible solution is, that education always has like a deeply moral dimension. And it seems to me some of the issues that you write about and have described, right, have that element in them. And so the skates that you mentioned, Apadurai speaks about, can be seen as bubbles that separate us. So is there some way of exploring this moral dimension of education in terms of breaking through these nation state or whatever these silos that we are developing? I'm just curious what you think. I'm honestly, right now, I am deeply pessimistic about the global project.
I think
curious to think what you think of that as.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are feeling that way. I just think the global project has speeded up so fast that people are kind of taken aback. News organizations now, there may be about 5 major news organizations for around the world, for the entire world. We've corporatized so much. The food supply. Now we see how a war in Ukraine is affecting food prices here. There's a there's a sense in which America wants to put up its walls and say, to hell with this. We want our own supply of gas. We want to keep our gas, which we actually have in abundance, for ourselves. But we can't escape from history. This is the direction that the world is moving. And we've got to equip citizens, young people, to deal with it. We can't just kind of walk away and say, "Oh, the global project, that was a good idea, but maybe it went too far." We just can't. We don't have the luxury to do that. We've got to accept, and there are some benefits. Your podcast is called Silver Linings. There's a number of silver linings. And one of them is in technology. And I'll go back to this collaboration idea that we didn't solve the vaccine problem alone. It was an international effort, as Young has said. It was and there's so many other ways in which we've overcome threats that have relied on collaboration. We've got tools inside the classroom where we can talk to people in Russia, in China, in Australia, everywhere around the world. We can set students on trying to solve problems together. Do we have the time and patience to do that? Do we feel it's relevant? Probably not yet. But we have to make the effort. Because these students will have to figure it out. The politicians are failing incredibly.
Well, I've got a couple of questions, but it's going to lead us in a slightly different territory. And I want to make sure we've exhausted this line. So Punya and Young, do you want to have any final questions or comments here on this, this thread?
From my side, go ahead, Kurt. We can always circle back if we need to.
Yeah, go ahead, Kurt. I want to make sure you ask your questions. I might come back to something if I have time. Go ahead.
Okay. So, Laurence, you've been at this for decades, and so is Young, so is Punya, so have I. You've written books over the past 2 decades, at least. So I want to get your sense of this change process and the transformation process over the past couple of decades. And you've partially answered my question already. And it's the one I would have said myself, because I've been working on collaborative technologies. In fact, I did a national, international survey on collaborative tools back in 1990. And there's some that were better than anything we have today, actually. But I'm wondering, what's the most significant progress that you've seen over the past 3 decades? And what are 2 or 3 themes that have kind of been in all of your books, or at least most of your books? What have you carried through within your writings that are consistent today that you're still working on and see some hope for, see some silver linings for now? And what have you already seen happen that has changed or transformed education for the better, if anything?
The most important essay that everybody must read that I discovered while I was writing the UN book is an essay by Immanuel Kant called Towards Perpetual Peace. And it's a short essay, and it basically talks about the right of the stranger, the right of hospitality to be given to the stranger. And it's enormously important because it establishes, maybe for one of the first times, the notion that there are rights that the stranger has, the immigrant, the refugee, to live. And those rights are reciprocal, that if you have been similarly displaced from a homeland or from a country, you have a right to reside, not fully, not permanently, but to be given hospitality in that other country. And the right is founded on the reciprocity of us as human beings, of fellow human beings, given each other, recognizing each other's rights. And it's this whole theme in history is constant, which is respect for human dignity. That your human dignity is wrapped up in respecting other people's human dignity. You can't have one without the other. And colonialism just basically threw a monkey wrench into that whole notion. But it's still the only valid way in which you can establish international law, justice, peace, harmony, and a future for the planet. If you understand that your dignity as a human being is dependent on that dignity being recognized by others. It's a fundamental concept, and it's the way in which schools need to operate. Everybody needs to operate, which is the notion that you need to be able to humanize people in the curriculum. You need to be able to give faces and voices to people in history. You cannot treat history as a story of one society or one group dominating and doing great things at the expense of others. And telling that story as if it's a grand success. This is the ways in which we need to proceed in the future. And you know, so you kind of have to go right back into the curriculum. You have to go right back into first principles, and you have to understand the core importance of that moral. You mentioned Punja, the moral kind of center of education. It still has a moral center. So I don't know if that hasn't answered your question, but I see it as a theme, because in each one of these books, it's about humanizing this world that we're living in, trying to figure out, despite all the images and all the constant noise, amazing amount of noise that's in the system, and it's creating these identities, false identities, fake notions, fake stories, that you kind of hold on to something solid. And the only way the key way you do it is by connecting with other human beings, that you try to throw all that other garbage out.
So in your slides that you hadn't gotten to, I had peeked at them, I looked at them, I edited them, in fact, and sent them back to you. You talk about EPALs and other organizations that are enabling these connections to happen.
Yeah.
And we've had people on previous weeks from World Savvy in Minneapolis and the Center for Global Education in Calgary. And you're writing about that, and you had 20 some organizations that are doing that.
Yes.
And so I wonder, in two things in my follow-up question, how would you change teacher education, pre-service teacher education, or in-service teacher education, I don't care, what would you do, first of all, to better address global education? Because you talk about integrating global ed across the curriculum in everything we do, and right now it's curriculum's just bloated, and teachers don't have time to even think about adding anything else in. But you're talking about integrating. Second thing, in your slides you mentioned something about culture, I think, and it's the culture is the key, I think you said.
Mm-hmm.
So what steps would you take to change or modify or transform school culture? So two-part: teacher training, in-service, pre-service, and schools themselves.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas that you want to share with us in that regard?
I'm really not sure if I can generalize about teacher training. I think that's a complicated idea because it involves practice as well as content. And you kind of, I'm happier with the idea that we should try to, help teachers to at least partner with another school, partner with another teacher, try to engage in at least one collaborative project a year with another school, possibly in an area where it has kind of global impact and is relevant to the students, because that's what they're asking for. Students, this is kind of I read an article, it's in the New York Times somewhere, it's saying that basically young people are in a world right now where there's a silent scream. They're finding the curriculum is just not working for them. It's just not relevant to what they want, what they're interested in. That there's this feeling that their futures have been compromised at the very deepest level. They feel this is just going through an exercise, that their real future, it has been compromised. So sort of like that book by Ishiguro, where the kids are in a controlled experiment. They're going to be used for organ donors. They don't know it. It's that sort of, and it goes back to the kind of deep pessimism that Punias has and others have expressed, that, the world is sort of in a very difficult, delicate place. But we're not telling them the truth. We're not giving them that access to what might be hopeful solutions. I think you have to tell them about the chaos and the chaotic nature of because we're living in a world now where, as I've said, of competing ideologies. People have competing ideas of truth. That has not happened before. We've had sort of a fairly rational discussion. The UN is broken down. I'm very depressed. I know this is off your question, but very depressed by the fact that one of the P5, Russia, has basically engaged in an aggressive war. When the UN mandate, one of the top key points of the founding of the UN was to prevent aggressive war. And as a P5 member, there should be the General Council. Anyway, there are procedures for dealing with that, but the procedures won't work under the present system. So the UN is basically neutralized. That's alarming. There's a little alarm bell ringing there. Just as there was a little alarm bell ringing when the Russians got near to the Chernobyl reactor, a little alarm bell saying, something in the world has changed drastically. Moral, values have changed completely around. So they're living in that kind of world. In order to kind of deal with that, you have to kind of tell the truth. But I think the positives are that you can't go back to telling them, okay, this is how it is right now, because no one knows how it is. No one can tell you a story now, a coherent story about how the world is shaping up. There can be all kinds of scenarios and all kinds of dystopias and visions for that future, but no one can give you a really good kind of comprehensive, it's just not going to work. The only thing that can work is students themselves, faced with a certain issue. Suppose we don't have a functioning UN. What kind of institution could you create that could overcome some of the obstacles that the UN has is now mired in. How do you solve, and the other issue is climate change. We could all see common interests and ways in which we can move forward in the area of climate change. There are some real solutions and there's some fake solutions. Let the students figure out what the real ones are, what the fake ones are. Where's real progress? I'm going off your question, but hopefully sticking.
So
It sounds like something that Punya and Young want to comment on. So
no, I actually want to hear from Zhao a little
Yeah.
bit, because I know Zhao's been making this, and I've been thinking about this a bit. I've been reading something that you wrote, or I don't know if it was on Twitter or somewhere. This idea that, this whole idea that, we are preparing as students for the future. And I think that what Laurence is saying is that since we have no clue what the future is going to be, that maybe the goal needs to be that the students be seen as creating the future, as creators of the future. So maybe, Zhao, can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think I saw that on Twitter somewhere, and it seems to sort of follow well from what Laurence is saying.
Yeah, thanks, Punya. Yeah, and Laurence. It is that we just wrote a book with the Bill McDermott. It's called "Learning for Uncertainty." I mean, the idea is that we used to have this view that we get students ready for the future, but the future doesn't exist, and the students are creators of the future. Mm-hmm. So that's the message. I think we need to get our students to be competent enough to create a better future, a more peaceful, more prosperous for all of us, because as I always joke, their future is our retirement. We might suffer a lot if they do not create such a future. Another actually comment I was going to make is, since you've written a lot about the United Nations, because I really view, right now we got a lot of dictatorial leaders around the world right now. It's kind of more like a zeitgeist. When time goes to a time, human beings dive into an era of stupidity, and then we just go in there and we rerun our own life. So I don't have a huge, prospect for human future. So I just want to hear about you, because you know so much about the United Nations. And where do you think it's going?
Oh, the United Nations. I think it has to be reformed drastically. You can't have the P5 anymore. You've got to expand it beyond the P5, and you've got to basically take the veto away from these countries that have held the veto for so long. You've got to have more democratic institution. It will grow. I mean, what the history shows is you've got to be patient, though. Institutions were built to solve certain problems. When they can no longer solve those problems, new institutions need to be created, or they have to, or if they can't be reformed. But one way or another, it is going to change. There is a turning point right now. You can't see all the parts of it, but it will end up, and so I think the point you just started with, which was the kids don't know the future. We don't know the future. Let them build the future. I get that. And that's the opportunity I think that educators have, is to say these institutions are not working. Let's try to figure out what institutions can work. Just be honest with students that institutions were built for a certain time period to solve a certain set of problems. And you can look at all kinds of institutions that have either fallen by the wayside or have been drastically changed. And so I can see, going back to Kurt's point about what you need to change around teacher training, teacher education. Suppose instead of having subjects and big subjects like history, part of the themes are institutions. Another theme is human dignity. Another theme is international collaboration. Go through these themes. History kind of tempts you into the one story narrative. Try to avoid that. Try to include a sense of agency within students, and a sense of openness about the future.
Punya?
So this is going to be a little bit of a tangent. I've been following for some reason last few weeks, I think because of my son who is sort of interested in this whole cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. I don't understand any of it because it's like, what is this craziness? And one thing that it became clear to me is, I think that the world we live in today has suddenly has revealed its seams in ways, and where its interconnections are, or where the breakdowns are in ways that was not very clear before. So I think we always lived in a world that we made up, right? I mean, through these scapes that we are talking about. I think what has happened in the recent past is that has just become obvious that this stuff is made up. And I think that is what's leading to a lot of frustration in people, because they see some groups or countries or individuals going very far ahead, others who are falling behind, but realizing that the system is rigged in some way, in certain ways. And I don't think it was very obvious before. And reading and listening to that literature around crypto and so on, and listening to some of these advocates, you can hear that frustration at the existing system and a willingness to sort of say, let's break this all up. And so that's what it makes it a very interesting and a weird time to be alive, to watch this. I don't know how else to describe it, but to say that the ruptures are now visible, right. Which we sort of took for granted in some ways. And that sounds very, dystopian or whatever. But I think that this is all made up anyway. It's just that now we are recognizing this stuff was just made up by us.
And we're recognizing a new culture is emerging, a new culture which says, basically, we don't have to follow this old method. All right, fine. How are you going to, and it's better to have that kind of culture of, kicking against the system that's not working than having the reverse, which has been the case for last few hundred years, where we just accepted things in a very kind of non-critical way. So the opportunity to get students engaged, I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. Get them thinking, use critical thought is really what we're about here. And so when people kind of complain about critical race theory, what they're really complaining about is critical. The word critical. It's they just cannot accept the idea that students can be critical of their world. Yes, they can. And there are ways in which they can use criticism to improve their reasoning and their logic and their understanding.
Laurence, I like what you were saying about, critical race theory. And Punias, thanks for doing that. So here's, I'm going to throw something out here. The idea about morality in all of this. So in some cultures, if you respect the culture, they're not supposed to be critical of their elders, of authority, and certain religions, you would not say, you want to challenge, the religious leaders or religious doctrine, all those kind of things. But at the same time, we're trying to teach kids to be critical or to be creative, to do those things. I just want to hear your comments, Laurence, from your wisdom. What do you think about that?
I love that question, because I've just come off teaching three classes of Chinese students who have a special, there's a special relationship with China and Johns Hopkins. They provide a master's degree in education for some very talented Chinese students whose English is really top notch, and who are really interested in global education. And I've had many discussions with them. Some, they're not very willing to talk in class, but off the record, they will talk to me about their frustration, their need to figure out a different kind of educational system than the one operating in large parts of China. They don't like the rote learning stuff. They believe that we need to move off of that. They understand that these large classrooms with large with authoritarian kind of teachers with one exam at the end of the game, which will determine everybody's fate, is not the way to run things. So they're full of enterprising ideas of how to do it. and many of them are going to go into the private sector. Many of them are developing apps. Many of them are figuring out ways in which that culture is going to be disrupted in China, just as it is here. No doubt about it in my mind. But it's not, if you were just listening to my classroom on the, you wouldn't get that kind of conversation. But the brightest kids in that group are going to move that society in ways that we have not imagined.
Go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah. So I have a question.
Time is just running out. We could have a long conversation, but I want to make sure you got 12 questions, Kurt. You just asked the one.
Well, my first two, I asked 4 of them, so we're okay. I just a side comment, Laurence. How long did it take you seriously to write this book? Was it a 2-year project, a 3-year, or a 1 month? I've got a deadline here.
It was about 16 months. It was a COVID project.
Okay.
And I just decided, I designed my own course on Introduction to Global Education Policy. And I thought there was a lot of work that needed to be put together that I found in different parts of the curriculum, parts of the library, as it were. And it would be hard for people coming into global education to figure out all the relationships of these different areas. For example, so you needed to bring in the colonial perspective. How does that work? How do you teach anti-colonialism? How do you begin to address it? How do you address this the pedagogy? How do you address culture in the school? The need for a whole school approach and not just an individual approach. That it hadn't been all those different perspectives. And how do you integrate some of the PISA information? I know PISA is not perfect, but it gives you a good indication of certain areas and issues. So all that. So thanks for that question. Yeah.
So maybe this is the second last question that we are going to have. I want us all to think about it. I'll have you answer it first, Laurence, and if Young and Punya want to jump in and answer after you, and then I'll try and answer it too. We are all interested in global education and the impacts, the potential impacts in the future, hopefully positive ones. We are all interested in cross-cultural collaboration, cross-institutional collaboration. We are all interested in enhancing the global competencies of our students, whether they're our graduate or undergraduate students or the high school students that we're studying, we're working with, or K-12, or people in the corporate world. I want to ask us all, how did the fire start? What was the first thing that you can recall? What was the one thing that inspired you to be interested in this area? Because the people watching the show later on, 6 months from now, are going to be dealing with students, might glean something from our answers and might be able to in turn set the fires within their students that they're mentoring and working with. So how did you get started on this road into the global classroom?
I'll keep it short. There's one book I found in a used bookstore about maybe 20 years ago now, maybe out of print. It's an analysis of the way in which British textbooks and American textbooks treated the American War of Independence. Just simple comparison and contrast, and how that story was told differently in the different textbooks. I said, well, this is really eye-opening. How the one story gets different interpretations. So that started the whole process along the way. Started me.
Young or Punya? Punya, go ahead.
That's interesting. You mentioned that because there's a wonderful book. I'm blanking on the name of the author now. It's called Prejudice and Pride, and it's an analysis of textbooks speaking about the Indian-Pakistani war of, not war of, but the independence movement, seen through the textbooks in India and Pakistan, because these two countries have very different myths of origin, right? Because in terms of how they each describe each other, or describe themselves. So India wanting to be a secular nation, Pakistan wanting to be the nation of the pure, of Islam. Wonderful sort of book which looks at how these historical narratives are constructed and created. So thank you for that, because that's a really interesting book as well, along the same lines that you mentioned. And I don't know about Young, but how I got into it is, in some ways, I am a child of globalization, right? In the sense that growing up in India, what I was reading was textbooks and other things written, by authors in the West, and then moving across the world and becoming a citizen of this country. In some ways, I am, and Zhao is part of the detritus that is the global world that we live in, right? I mean, so there was no way one could escape that in terms of one's personal history, and the value of it, right?
So talk about personal history. I'm living on a street now. It's the middle of suburban Rockville, Maryland. I have a Chinese neighbor on my left. I have a Russian neighbor on my right. I have an Iraqi neighbor on the top. It is that kind of world today, and I'm so pleased to have all these different groups of people around me. I love diversity. I think it's something we haven't touched on in this discussion, but schools have to start treating diversity as a value, as a resource, and it is incredible how they turn the tables. They think diversity is a negative. It can never be a negative. You can learn so much from the students who are in that classroom about their worlds. You can begin to have a dialogue that you could never have before. You had a homogeneous group of students.
Young, I'll let you jump in for a minute, then I got an answer. Go ahead.
Well, my globalization really started with Punia, seriously, because, I grew up in China. It's nothing, all the information is constrained. I did not even know things existed. I mean, seriously, other people. So I came to the US, in Illinois. I began to interact with people of other races. Now you got global. Later on, I traveled I stayed in England for half a year, Australia, so I traveled to give a lot of talks. So my thinking is always to say, I don't really believe there is a global competency for everybody, because everyone approaches globalization from their own self-interest. And that's why I really want to go back to really two concepts of globalization: is interdependence and interconnectedness. So human beings, no matter how high you want to drive for the collective well-being, they are, selfish genes. Mm-hmm. So they have to see how their interests are connected or affected by others. On this show, we talk about, why should sub-Saharan countries or the Amazon countries to say, we're not going to cut our forests because you guys want our fresh air. So I mean, it's quite complicated, this issue. And so what I would say, you have to think about the self-interest, and how do you drive the self-interest into the benefit of others. We cannot just go tell other countries, no, you cannot burn fossil fuel anymore because, we don't like it. We are having good time. I mean, the Indians, the Chinese say, heck with you. We got to burn it because otherwise, where do we get our kind of prosperity?
And you've got to show them how you can go green and profit from it. But first of all, the West has to kind of figure out the economic model, because they're going to have to sell these green products everywhere. But that's another story.
All right. Anyway, that's just my view. So Kurt, go ahead. We got about 1 minute.
Right. So, I got kickstarted into this field in high school, taking a history class from a guy named Kim Rohde. And he ended up in my sophomore year, my American history, over and over again. We take American history, the same, just a little more in the textbook every year, But in my junior year, he's teaching humanities. And I loved that course because we went to a synagogue and we had a Swami come in to do meditation, and all sorts of things were going on in that class. And then he had Humanities 2 the following year, and I'm definitely going to take that class. And in high school, I was in West Dallas, Wisconsin with 71,997 white people and 3 African Americans. It's not that way anymore today, as 35 years later. But it, in fact, was Trump. Trump went there to do one of his speeches in my old gymnasium. It kind of made me throw up, but okay. But when I got to college, the same thing happened. My best friend. So my best friends in high school were foreign exchange students from France and from India and Pakistan, and that. The same thing happened in college. My best friends or people I hung out with, were from Ghana and other parts of Africa, and and the same is true when I got to. That was undergrad. In grad school, the same thing. Korea and Taiwan. I'm just because that humanities class triggered something in me to learn about cultures of the world. I started seeking out in wherever I am, trying to understand people. And so Mr. Rodi lit the match. And my life has been a consistent, persistent journey into global education, collaboration, and exchanges with the peoples of the world. And I was lucky to get an international engagement award from my university because I'm constantly, like I said, in my new book, Transformative Teaching Around the World, has 22 countries, 47 chapters from people in 22 countries. I'm always seeking ways in which I can learn from other people, and I edit their chapters over and over again. It's not to make them better; it's to work with these people. So, anyways, that's my bias. My bias is always to work with someone who knows something that I don't know and can enlighten me about their culture. And so, this has been a wonderful show, Laurence, and I really appreciate you coming in here and chatting with us about your perspective in the field and what you've done to help it push it along. And I'm sure you'll be doing more of this, and maybe we'll bring you back in the future and get an update from you. Punya is going to introduce the next show, and you might go ahead, Punya.
Sure, thank you. We all think of ourselves as being these complex, unique individuals, but increasingly what we are is a stream of data. A stream of data which can be diced and manipulated and sliced in different ways to, categorize us, our behaviors, our activities, and so on. So that's, we live in the age of big data. So there's this great story that Yuval Harari says that if he had grown up today, that Facebook would most probably have recognized his sexual orientation before he even recognized it, because Facebook would be looking at clicks and moves and likes and dislikes that he would be making on the media and be able to identify his orientation while he was still trying to figure out what it was and how and who he was, what his identity was. And so, of course, this has implications for education because a large part of learning today is happening in digital environments that can preserve data about every click, scroll, touch, and so on. Of course, there are great positives that can emerge from that in terms of personalization and so on. But it also brings about worries of the surveillance state, brings about worries of surveillance capitalism, of our students' data being misused in ways which are biased, and so on and so forth, right? So that will be the topic of our next episode, Big Data and Education. And our guests will be Avriel Epps-Darling, Andrew Ho, and Katina Michael. Avriel is a computational social scientist and a PhD student at Harvard. Andrew Ho is a professor at the Harvard School of Education, and Katina Michael is a colleague of mine here at Arizona State University, where she works at the Global Futures Laboratory, as well as the Future of Innovation and Society in the School of Computing. So really looking forward to that conversation next week. Same time, same place. See you there. And again, Laurence, thank you so much.